Okay. I suppose the story of my life is partly a story of the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, and that has been a question that has troubled many of us, who are more middle class, intellectually inclined, and trying to find a niche for ourselves in the Southeast Asian context. And for me, very important was the time that I spent in America. I stayed in America for on and off for about 10 years, from 1970 to 1979. When I graduated with my PhD. So entirely my academic career is actually American, and I had left here to go to America in 1970, and that was just immediately after the May 13 racial riots, which happened in Kuala Lumpur. And Malays, Chinese were fighting one another, and that was how it was interpreted for us. So when I went to America, that was, I was already asking myself a lot of questions, and not just me. My fellow Malaysians who were in America, they were also very disturbed by what happened, and we wanted to understand what was it, why did it happen? Why did it take this racial, configuration? It coincided also with the Vietnam War, So I was, and when it was in a sense, it was the height of the Vietnam War, and the protest movement was starting, was beginning to take place a lot. So I had a very personal question I wanted answered, which was related to what was happening in Malaysia, but the question was intertwined with a broader question about what was happening in Indochina. Why the Vietnam War? Why was the American doing things like that? And I'd gone to a small college called Dartmouth, and Dartmouth is in New Hampshire. It's an Ivy League school, a very prestigious school and all that. And you would go to class and, suddenly your classmate was very, very concerned because he had been drafted and he had to go and fight for America in Vietnam. And he didn't want to do it. Why should I go and kill Vietnamese people whom I don't know, and for whom? For this America which he didn't understand. So these are the kinds of questions that arose, And so at Dartmouth I began to work, began to interact, work with people who were anti-war. So I began to get involved in demonstrations in that manner. And I remember we had a massive march, that was called in Washington, and we went by bus loads from different parts of America, to Washington to protest this war. And every week thereafter, in my college, on I think Wednesday afternoon, lunchtime, a small group of us, would gather in front of the main one of the main buildings where people came to collect their mail every day. And we would just stand there, as a mark of respect for the people who were killed in Vietnam, or in Indochina more generally, that past week. And no more war in Indochina, we would carry that kind of placard. And we began to collect money for medical aid to Indochina. So it was thought you're not supporting the, communists in any way. You were not, So it was sort of a middle range type of effort of protesting the war, and it, a lot of ordinary people, who were troubled by the war but didn't want to take sides. They would actually come and donate money, and we'll collect this money, send it down to friends elsewhere, and it was all for the purpose of providing medical aid, to war victims, that sort of thing. So this was something that was happening. And it was during this period of time, I suppose, that I had gone to America as a science student. I was, and I wanted I thought I was going to become a doctor. But very soon after, I decided that I wanted to study more of the social science. I was not like the best science students. There were a lot of Hong Kong boys and Singapore boys and, and a lot of Indians, who were much better science students than I was, and I couldn't compete with them. But I found my niche in trying to understand society more. And so I began to study politics and history, and there were certain influential people, where I was studying, who introduced me to Southeast Asia. So that took place, and in my second year, I went to France to study, for a semester abroad program, and discovered that actually this was, post-68 Paris, and there was a student uprising throughout Europe as well. So it wasn't just America against the war, it was actually about people against, the de Gaulle's government, and, the young people were looking for answers, and of course during this period, the Cultural Revolution was taking place in China, or just after it, and a lot of questions also people, were being asked then. So, I was caught in the throes of all of these things, so I had a personal question I was asking, but, you fitted into, hey, you have to ask a bigger question. You have to look at the bigger picture and not just your small picture. So it was at this point that I began to, the next year in my junior year, I actually came back to Southeast Asia. And I had already decided I didn't want to do sciences, I wanted to study Southeast Asia, social science, history and all that. So that was a very, very important year for me, because I began to travel all over Southeast Asia for the first time in my life. I had not gone out to any other country outside of Malaysia except for Singapore. But now I went up to, I remember, our program started in Singapore, and I got to know more about, back street Singapore, the poor areas of Singapore, which you didn't think exists, but it was all there. And I took a train up, to all the way to Chiang Mai, and we were supposed to conduct, I think 3 weeks of research, so I just discussed. So on the way, I remember as I was passing through southern Thailand, it's a big, the southern Thailand problem is currently a big issue, but it was already an issue then. I remember this train of ours, we were driving through southern Thailand and it had to be stopped. And we were wondering why this train had to be stopped. And, there were some skirmishes. And then after a while, they brought, some people onto the train who had been, they had been hurt by, fighting and things like that. So the train just traveled on. Then we went to Bangkok, and then finally I made my way up to Chiang Mai. But all along the way, you could see the American presence in Southeast Asia, and in a place, on the way to outside Ayutthaya called Lop Buri. And in Lop Buri, I didn't realize this then, but later on I read about this. This was a major CIA, center, operation center and all that. And there was a huge American presence there, And so, you could see that it was all connected. So I went there, and then after that, after I did some interviews about what was going on, and I came back. And then this trip, after then I went home for a few weeks, and then our program continued. And this time I went down to Indonesia, flew in, then we spent a lot of time in Yogyakarta for a few weeks. And Yogyakarta opened me to the fact that, hey, Southeast Asia is a major civilization of its own right. So we went to all the, so you learn that. And then finally I went to Bali. And at the end of my program, we had finished our exams and everything, and then I took a boat and I went to Kalimantan, southern Borneo, and there were logging camps there, and the logging camps, were owned by, basically run by the generals, and this was all corrupt, very corrupt logging activities and all that, and then after that I actually took another boat up to northern Borneo, and then finally I went back to Sabah, Sabah, which is Malaysia. And it was quite an interesting trip for me because I went into my own country through the backwaters, through river creeks, so it was all a different kind of Southeast Asia for me. It was not an urban Southeast Asia, so this was a very, very important experience for me. And I went to Sabah and I climbed up, Kota Kinabalu, the tallest peak in Southeast Asia, and I finally took another boat. These are boats which are basically, they're not passenger boats, they're cargo boats. So, you go and sleep on deck, and no, I went from southern Borneo. I actually went on a boat further out to Sulawesi, the Celebes, and then at some point I trekked up the mountains with some other people, and I found another group of people called the Tok Raja people, who are animist Christians, and I was just astounded by their culture, which was so different, so vibrant, and people's identity. So that's, for me, it was just a huge awakening, important complement to what I was reading in the books, and so I decided at the end of this 9 months, in Southeast Asia, that there's no doubt about it, I'm going to study more of Southeast Asia. I want to be a Southeast Asian scholar. I will study its politics, I will study its culture, I will study its economic development and all that. And then I graduated from my college, and I had written a thesis on the Islam and nationalism in Malaya and Indonesia. And this is a very new area for me because I'm studying Islam. So I thought, I wrote a decent thesis, and then I decided, okay, I'm going to graduate school. And so I went to Cornell, and Cornell, I had selected Cornell because I wanted to work with two people in particular, and one was Professor George Cahin. He was the doyen of Southeast Asian studies in a sense. He was the man who set up the Indonesia project in Cornell, and the other person I wanted to work with was a student of his who had become a professor, a young professor, and that was Benedict Anderson. So I ended up, studying with the grandfather and the father. So I was like a third generation. So, and at this point in time, it was just a big exposure to me. And then so I went to Cornell, and I've chosen to go there to study with these two people. And what was very important was that George Cahin was Mr. Scholar Activist. He's the Mr. Scholar Activist because he was one of about 5 people, academics at that point in the late 1970s. The early 1970s. George Cahin basically was the leading academic on Southeast Asian affairs. And he was going around the country at all these, sit-ins and teach-ins, and he was leading these kinds of debates against the State Department, the Department of Defense, and all that. So he would, go on, in the university and debate against McGeorge Bundy, which were all the sets, all these very, very important people in the Defense Department and all that. So because I developed an interest in the war in Vietnam, I was very interested in, I was against the war and all that. So this was the man I wanted to study with. And so, he was there, and to my surprise, he would say, oh no, you do more of your work with George, with Ben Anderson, because Ben Anderson is more interested in Malaysia and all that, whereas he was more interested in Vietnam. Although originally he had written a book called Nationalism and Revolution in Indonesia, which is like the classic on the Indonesian struggle for independence. and it's like a book that we all read if you want to do Indonesian politics, So, and Ben Anderson had, taken up one part of George Cahin's book, and focused on that aspect of it. And am I moving too much?
No, no, it's okay.
So Ben Anderson had written a book called The Pemuda Revolution, which was actually the revolution of the youths during the Indonesian struggle for independence. So, they sort of like Ben Anderson's book actually then complements George Cahin, which George Cahin talked about Sukarno, Hatta, and things like that, And George Cahin is an incredible guy. I mean, he was the first out to Indonesia. The Indonesian struggle for independence, the revolution broke out in 1947, so to speak, and when they declared their independence. And George Cahin was the first American out in Indonesia after the war, and he went there to do field work. The notion of field work was a very new idea, so he was there. And he had a Jeep which he had bought from the American GIs and all that, and he became like the driver for Sukarno. So all this is recorded in his memoirs, So he was very, very pro-revolution, and for a while he had ran into a lot of trouble with the U.S. State Department authorities when he came back, and so this George was, in the thick of things during the Indonesian Revolution, and the concern then they had was that, these are all communists, and George would say, I don't know about that, but they are definitely fighters for independence, because and they are equidistant to all of these movements. There are communists involved, there are secular nationalists, there are Islamicists and all that, and they're all part of the Indonesian Revolution. So George pushed this line very, very strongly. So when I was at Cornell, a couple of very important few incidents took place that I was sort of like just drawn into. I mean, I was studying all the time, we had a lot of papers to write, but 1976 was the coup in Thailand. It was a series of things, 1973 and then 1976 as well. And what happened was that the Southeast Asia program under Ben Anderson and George Cahin, they basically held another teach-in and mobilize people to think, if you were interested in Southeast Asia, let us think about this issue, and what is your position? You better know what your position is, and why you're taking such a position. And they feel that actually if you speak truth to power, truth will always prevail. So they wanted to teach people what was happening. You just don't make decisions out in the cold, back in Washington, you don't know what's happening. So Ben Anderson had just come back from Thailand, and he led this discussion and everything. So that was a very important, the whole Southeast Asia program at Cornell was mobilized for this purpose. And it continues the tradition of opposing the war in Vietnam, because the war in Vietnam begins to wind down by 1974 with the Hanoi peace talks and all that. So, and then then there was the Indonesian invasion of Timor. Again, we mobilized everybody, and Noam Chomsky was directly involved in this, and he also came to campus, but also the people in Cornell, so they played so again, it was, you really nearly, you just get dragged in, because your study of Southeast Asia cannot be isolated, from all these real things happening on the ground, so that began to be the impact that it had on me, and I knew that, if I'm going to study Southeast Asia, I'm going to be an activist in that manner, you see, I must get involved in the big issues as well. And remember I said I started off about asking my question about what happens, to me later on when I go back to Malaysia, because there had been racial riots, 1969, racial riots. So it's, it's this whole trend begins to continue. And I remember at that point in time, when I was at Cornell, Mao passed away. and so a lot of all the Chinese students were all mobilized, to celebrate the history of the Chinese Revolution, but at the same time to pay respects to this man, and so I was very moved by that whole, big celebration of his contribution to the Chinese Revolution, and that was yet another incident. And then there would be a lot of these Vietnamese generals going on tour in Southeast Asia, making, to talk about the war in Vietnam from their perspective. And, whenever they came to campus, we would demonstrate and, we disagree with that position. Some people then rush into the building to protest. But our position was, we will debate them. Let them have their say, but if they get ridiculous, we'll boo them, but we will give them a chance to say what they want to say. So this was the mood in American campuses, especially, and since I was interested in Southeast Asia, Cornell was one place that all these people would show up in. And we would then also get involved in these kinds of issues in that sense. So at some point, I took my exams and I came back to Malaysia to do my field work, and I chose to study the Chinese new villages in the state of Perak, which is around Ipoh. It's another state across. So in this place, this had been the richest alluvial tin mining region in the world. It was the leading exporter of tin ore to the world, and yet there was a lot of poverty all over the place, and this was basically a Chinese immigrant population which had settled in this place. And I was very keen to understand. I wasn't interested in studying Kuala Lumpur and high power politics, the leaders and all that. I wanted to go down, So I stayed in this village for almost a year, and every day I would follow these people out to the fields, and these are people who used to be tin mining workers. The tin mining industry has virtually collapsed, so they are growing cash crops, tapioca, groundnuts, fresh vegetables, and in the disused mining pools they would grow fish. They were real fish. So that was, for 1 year, this was my life. I stayed in the rural areas, very primitive toilets, and this was at this time that my Chinese improved a lot. So you're forced to use it. I have to study a bit to know how to speak, properly, and so my Mandarin, but also my Hakka improved a lot because of this.
But your family is Chinese?
I'm English educated. The family is completely Chinese.
Yes,
but
they come, did your grandparents come here, or
I'm 第四代, so my great-grandparents came from China, no, from Guangdong, from, so they are Hakka, so it's here that I began to use a lot more Chinese. Otherwise, I'd gone to school completely in English. I'd gone to a mission school, and this was, I started school in 1956 or 57, 1957, I started school, and it was still, independence time, and everything was still in English. So I went up to Form 6 in basically English, So as I was saying then, so I did this research, and it was a big eye-opener to me, but it also sort of triggered off the pattern of study that I would conduct for very much the rest of my life up till now, because I've always wanted to study not the center but actually the periphery. So I hardly do research in Kuala Lumpur. I hardly go and talk to the big time politicians. I would go down to study, and I think this gives me a different perspective generally about what's happening, and I ask different kinds of questions. Later on, when I I will move to Sabah. So I spent, years studying Sabah, which is again very peripheral, and different kinds of people, and actually my own understanding of Sabah politics has gained more from people like Jojo Abinales and people who study Southern Philippines. They share more commonalities, what's happening in Southern Philippines and the people in Sabah, than actually if I study the Malayan Peninsula, or for people like, who go and study Manila and all that. It's a very different perspective. So, and, of late I have been, then I studied the Indians in Malaysia. I've published an article which I'm very proud of. We study the Indians in Penang, and they are minority within, a state which is dominated by Chinese. So it's that's and in a sense now, then subsequently I study the NGOs and the civil society movements and all that, rather than the political parties. And I do that as well, but I also do this kind of perspective from the side, as it were. And so, but that's, let's go back a bit. So I finished this study of the New Villagers, and then I went back to Cornell. When I came back, I joined the university here.
But then the decision to come back, how was it made? Because a lot of you would prefer to stay in the States and not come back.
Yeah, it was very, very clear, because in America, in my Cornell years, actually beginning in the last 2 years, after I come back from the trip in Southeast Asia, I began to look for fellow Malaysians also other, people who are from other countries, but I looked especially for the fellow Malaysians, and we began to get involved in the student movement in America. So I was secretary of something called PEMAU, Pelajar Malaysia di Amerika Utara, which is the Malaysian student movement in North America. So I became the secretary, and we organized annual meetings, and when we would call Malaysian students from all over America, and this is quite interesting because it could be I remember the first time I went, it was held in a place, the first meeting I went to was in Boston, which was very, easy ride for me because I was in New Hampshire. And this is always over the Christmas to New Year period. So about 5 days, we'll all gather together. And the second year, we went to Atlanta, Georgia. So we all will arrange, we'll rent all these big, cars, and then we'll put in, 10 students, and then we'll drive in convoy to, the south. And then another year was in Illinois, northern Illinois, and then we'll drive to Illinois. And then 1 year it was held in Cornell when we hosted. So we played a very big role in organizing this. And these are very important events, although it happens only once a year, to make the Malaysian students who are overseas, aware of what's happening in their country. So we did this, and it was also a very eye-opener for many of us, because I mentioned to you previously there was all these racial riots, and we wanted to address these questions. We wanted to bring Malays, Chinese, Indians, people of all these groups of people together. And overseas, you can discuss some issues which you might not be able to discuss in Malaysia. So, so because of this kind of, involvement, when I was overseas, we always told the students, you have to go back home to serve the people. That was the mood, and it was in tune with the times, student activism and all that, So there was, when it was my turn to come home, there was no question about it. We were all coming home. So I came home, with my PhD, or, I was waiting to, I didn't attend my graduation, but, we just, as soon as I came back, then I got a position in Singapore, just in case I don't get any other job. Finally, I came back to Penang when they offered me a job. So, I came back to my hometown, you know, and that's what I wanted to do, you know. So, and once we were back, and my contemporaries, I should mention some of them who were with me, and we influenced one another. One of my contemporaries then in America, and we all came back about the same time, was Jomo, Professor K.S. Jomo, you know, who subsequently becomes a very prominent scholar of economic development of Southeast Asia and all that, you know, and Malaysia. And then he became the Assistant Secretary of the United Nations, you know. He was also a professor of economics. And there was another very, very close friend of mine called Ku Kejin, you know, and Kejin studied in Columbia. So, you know, we used to interact with one another very, very closely, all of us. And we would do study groups, you know, about understanding what's happening in the country. We also read, you know, theory about, you know, radical theory, you know, from different traditions and all that. So, and I don't know if you're aware, but at that period, the new, a revivalism of Marxist scholarship was taking place. So this was the kinds of, you know, books that we read, you know, I mean, so Marx became very fashionable again because of what was happening throughout the world, you know, at that point in time, the student uprisings, you know, Paris, you know, LSE, and, you know, American students. So there was a honeymoon, you know, so to speak, with a new relook at, you know, Marxism, you know. So, you know, I was also caught in this. And so dependency theories, you know, and then Moto Ichio, you know, going to Binghamton to teach, you know, with the Immanuel Wallenstein group and all that. That was all part of this ferment in political ideas and all that was taking place. And we used to study, you know, like a lot of French structuralist theorists, you know, the Althusser, Poulanzas and all that. When I came back and brought all this back with me, I suddenly discovered, not applicable. Not directly applicable, you know what I mean? You know, this doesn't help me to understand what's going on in Malaysia, you know? So you had to then look for new ideas and or develop your own kinds of ideas, you know, and but in general we understand, you know, the big broad sweeps, you know, of structural analysis is very important, but we are very, very concerned about agency. You know, agency is very important. You know, my favorite lines from Marx in the 18th Brumaire is, the opening lines is, man makes the traditions of the great generations weigh like a ton over the minds of the living. You know, man makes his own history, but he does not do so as he pleases. He does so under conditions, you know, transmitted from the past. So, you know, for me, this is brilliant. This is what my understanding of social science is all about. So you have to look at the big structures, you have to look at traditions, you know, and within that context, you can reshape history, but not, you know, like in a vacuum. You cannot do it in that manner. There is always a context within which you must operate, you know, as in like the Chinese tradition, you know, I mean, the Chinese revolutionaries had to do that. So likewise in our case, so this was how we, so we used to study these things together, you know, and so we came back. What was interesting about my bunch of friends and is that we became actually academics. The special, this is a group of, I suppose, more elitist intellectuals who came from the top universities in America. You know, like I mentioned, Kejin went to, you know, Columbia. Our friend Jomo went to Harvard. You know, there's another friend called Cecilia Ng. Cecilia, who's a big-time feminist in Malaysia. She's written one of the best books on feminism in Malaysia. So she actually went to, you know, Harvard as well. And then like somebody like Johan, you know, Johan went to UBC, you know, in Vancouver, you know, University of British Columbia. So we went to these kinds of places. So we were, you know, we had these tremendous opportunities to broaden our way of thinking. But at the same time, we had to begin to come down to earth, to begin to look for local answers and understand the local situation much, much better lah. So I started teaching in the university 1979. And at some point I will go away 85, 86, 87 when there was a big dragnet operation Lalang which takes place in Malaysia in 1987. But actually I was out of the country then when they arrested 100 over activists and all that. So I was out of the country at that point. So some of my friends were all detained, but not me. We were outside the country. And so we came back and we began to, there was, at that point in time, the Barisan Nasional was firmly in power. And the economy was generally booming throughout the region. And we had a very, very hard time fighting, combating, challenging the ideas, because everybody was improving their economic livelihood, in general. From the poor was getting less poor, rich were getting super rich, but it wasn't the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. It was not like that, So you had very difficult struggles, and the only thing that was bothering us a lot was the whole ethnic conflict. It was there, and when we tried to, there was a small Parti Socialist Rakyat Malaysia, the People's Socialist, Malaysian People's Socialist Party. Very small. It was like what some people would call a mosquito party. But that was the party that many of us would want to get involved in. It was led by, among other people, Qasim Ahmad, and Syed Hussein Ali. Syed Hussein Ali, who was a fellow of Arena in the old days. So that was his party, and I remember very clearly when we wanted to all join, we wanted to push the party faster. The instruction that was generally given to us is, yeah, you are ready, but actually the rakyat, the people are not ready. And you need to do a lot more grassroots work, work for. So it's, you can have the best ideas, but if nobody follows you, what's the point? So you must go win the hearts of these people, go down. And the Chinese generally were ready, but not the Malay rural people. Chinese middle class, they're very frustrated, they have been denied certain kinds of, their fundamental rights, cannot do this, and they feel for their language. So there's, in Malaysian politics, always this traditional difference between the Chinese left and the Malay left. Their concerns are quite different. At the very top, we can come together. But, the followers of different, at the bottom of this, they operate quite different. And the Chinese left traditionally had been very influenced by what was happening in China, which is not necessarily translated in that way. You cannot use those arguments to mobilize the Malay, masses. So you have to, where Islam is very important, where they feel for, their traditions, and all that, which is very, very different. So, this was the party. So we decided at that point that we would go into NGO work. So, in the 1970s, the first NGOs began to emerge. So sometimes they say that it was also because there was no real alternative party for us to join, and we definitely didn't want to join the big parties, which were all ethnic based. And May 13 had happened, and May 13, 1969, the racial riots had happened. So you wanted to actually make sure that but however you organize, you must also address the question of multi-ethnic relations. You cannot just talk about, transforming the economy, getting involved in politics and all that. You had to address the whole question, of the, that solidarity between Malays and Chinese and Indians. So, so this was an issue that we had to grapple with. So we started NGOs, and the organization I went into was one which, by its principle, was actually to promote multiracial relations. Justice, solidarity, justice, freedom, and the third word is actually solidarity. And solidarity is not with the masses per se, but actually it's also across ethnic lines, across religious lines. And this organization actually, the first principle is actually belief in the common belief that we have in God, which turns off some people, but we also broadly allow people to interpret God as, truth. So some people, okay, then I'm looking for the truth, and you can interpret the search for God in that manner. Yeah.
But does that include Christians and Muslims?
Oh yeah, Christians, Muslims, and the first leader was somebody who was actually a Muslim. So they had set up this organization, Aliran, in 1977.
That is Aliran.
Yeah, this is Aliran. I only joined in 1981. And people were joining different kinds of organizations. So people like Jomo and the people in Kuala Lumpur like Cecilia Ng and Ramasamy, and Nasir, they set up something called Nadi Insan. They set up something called Insan. Insan means actually the nation, and then they call themselves the Nadi Insan, which actually means the pulse of the nation, So they were more outrightly left. They don't talk about God the way that we talk about, but it was definitely an attempt to bridge the ethnic gap, So likewise, we were trying to do this over here. And in a sense, it was new initiatives which didn't organize along ethnic lines, but we wanted to bridge, right from the word go, we wanted to bridge the ethnic difference, and by definition, the organization has to be multi-ethnic, has to be multi-religious, and then there were other, consumer associations and all that, but so this was what was beginning to happen. And I continued on in this organization. There were ups and downs, some people disappointed us and everything, but in 1991, I became the secretary. And I held this position for about 20 years. And there were many times early on when they wanted to pass me the job, to head this organization, but I always found some excuse not to do so. But as soon as I stepped down as, from the university, and when I retired, they say, okay, it's your turn, So it's a very interesting state of affairs, because in our organization there is no struggle for power. Nobody wants the job, and it's just a huge burden. So I've held this position since 2001. I was secretary for 20 years, and then I became the president in 2011. I'm just a very new president, but I served in the steering committee, the main group, as secretary for 20 plus years.
So until which year? From 1991 till?
About 2001, 2011. And then
after being secretary, then you are the president.
Yeah. And so it's a bit more responsibility, but we operate actually as a team. We operate as a team. And usually the president is somebody who is not somebody who is still working and in the government, as in the university or something, because that makes them very vulnerable. They can be sacked and everything like that. So as soon as I retired, I was not vulnerable in the same way anymore. So and one of the things that we have been doing in Aliran is we have all the time been pushing for, in the beginning, we used to work in coalitions, with the few NGOs. In the 1980s, there were very, very few NGOs in town. And that was, 1980s was a period of political ferment in the country. And that was the time when, for for the first time in my life, we had street demonstrations in Malaysia, and so among other things, there was they tried to create established radioactive waste dumps, in a place called Papan and in a place called Bukit Merah. They're actually very close to where I had done my field work in 1978, 79 when I was doing my PhD. This in the Kinta Valley. So they discovered, one of the things that they discovered, that actually a lot of when they mined tin, and they were extracting tin, but actually there were a lot of rare metals which are used for making, among other things, like very light, metals which could be used for aeroplanes, to make, and they're very durable. So they began to remine this. But in the process of mining this, you leave radioactive waste. So they were going to create some dumps in these places. And there was a big protest by the residents, protesting against this. And in Penang, they wanted to redevelop Penang Hill to make it sort of a Disney World. So we mobilized to protest against that, So there were these kinds of activities which began to take place. We had big meetings and all that. And so that was the first, that was in the 80s. And then like I said, like in 1987, and then we also mobilized to fight against corruption, cronyism. That was a big, big issue then. And the political parties had begun to set up what they call deposit-taking cooperatives, where they began to bring all the Hui Guan, the Si Tuan, and all that, and then collect money from their members, and then they use it to then move into the corporate sector, and the money was sometimes abused, and then there was also a lot of corruption involving. Actually, it was called the BMF, Bumiputra Malaysia Finance Corporation. And the money, the branch that was involved in this whole exercise was actually based in Hong Kong. It was the branch of BMF in Hong Kong. And actually the officer there was killed in Hong Kong. It became a big issue. Because why was he killed? You see, because he apparently was going to do this expose. So people began to investigate, and the government, to their credit, set up an investigation of this issue, and so we mobilized against that and got the government to then do this investigation. So that was the 1980s, and then it culminated in the crackdown of we call it Operation Lalang. Lalang is this, wild lalang is wild grass. Lalang, yeah, Lalang, lalang. It's just waste grass, wild grass. It just blows in the wind and all that. So all these radicals were basically lalang. They come and eat up the seeds, destroy the soil. So we were described as the lalang. So the operation, was Operation Lalang. So they captured all these people. But I told you, at that point in time, I wasn't here. So people like me, and Jomo was also not here. He was actually in Cambridge, and we would, organize from outside. And so we did that. So by the time we came back, the late 80s and all that, the economy had stabilized again, and it was double-digit growth and all that. I remember when we had people like Randy David come over to visit us, and Abdurrahman Wahid, who was still, not involved in politics yet. And then they'll come and look at Malaysia, and we'll take them out, and then they'll say, actually, what is your problem in Malaysia? you seem to be economically doing quite well, you know, and you have an electoral system. It is not like in Thailand where the military coup is taking place and all that. So we have to explain that, oh, not, you know, so we have to use terms like deepening democracy, you know, we want to have more participatory democracy, you know, these were our terms, and then of course more equitable distribution. And, you know, we caught on very quickly to sustainable development. Because these had to be our issues, because we were not talking about, you know, there is famine here and, you know, these people. But all the time, from the beginning up till then, it was always ethnic relations. So we still that continued to be on the agenda. And meanwhile, in this period of time, the Islamic fundamentalist movement begins to take off. So there was a new dimension to this problem. And in the beginning, you know, the Islamic fundamentalist movement was basically a protest movement, because after the crackdown, they began to, you know, use Islam as in a way to protest against things. You know, and but you know, especially after the Iranian Revolution, you know, it takes a different turn. You know, it begins to get more and more fundamentalist, and, you know, increasingly conservative, and begin to fight for an Islamic state. So you have to make this distinction as you engage with Muslims, as you engage with Malays. You know, you must be very aware of what's happening within those realms as well. So in our relationship with the Parti Islam today, for instance, actually you see that, you know, you cannot just, you know, like paint everybody the same color. It's a spectrum. So you have, you know, very, very conservative Muslims who are against, you know, women's rights, you know, who are not for, you know, democratization and all that, you know, and they want basically to create an Islamic state, to put in Sharia law, and to hudud, where you chop off hands, you know, that's the agenda. But within the party, you also have people who are more influenced by what was happening in Turkey. So the Erdogan types, you know, although Erdogan himself has taken a bit of a turn, you know, he's beginning to, in his second, third term, you know, he's now the president. But, you know, the Erdogans are actually, you know, more liberal, more plural. And they had gone into the party basically because they thought that the Muslim leaders were the most sincere. They were not involved in corruption. Whereas actually Anwar Ibrahim's party, which was a new party that was created later on after Reformasi, you know, this party was actually, the core of it was actually from UMNO. You know, so you had a new party, you had a new name, you have a new slogan, you have a new, you know, emblem and all that. But actually, the critical mass of the members in that party actually came from the womb of UMNO. And it was not clear that they had changed their attitudes and their ways. But they were in opposition now, you know. Until such time when Syed Hussein Ali, his party actually went into a merger with Anwar's party. So the Socialist Party that I talked to you about, it went into a merger with this party, that actually then its orientation became a bit more clear. You know, so, you know, I was talking about the Muslims, you know, and why actually there's a whole, you know, whole range of people who are joined the party, but actually they were ideologically not necessarily the same, you know. And so people like us then, you know, and Reformasi happened in the, you know, fast forward 10 years later. You know, we were talking about 1919, the late 1990s, you know, the arrest takes place, the economy crashes for the first time. 10 years later, you know, the economy crashes again. You know, this is the great East Asian financial crisis of 1997-98. And it coincides again with a breakup of UMNO. So every time we have made political progress, very much, you know, it related to the economy crashing, but at the same time, a split taking place within UMNO. You know, otherwise its hegemony is so powerful, you know, very, very powerful hegemony, that control. And so when they split, you know, then it opens, you know, a hole for us. And then we make advances during that time. But the last 1997, when Anwar was sacked, you know, and all that, so it opens up, you know, a whole avenue for people like us to then find a space. And so we went into coalition with them initially, you know, the NGOs and the new opposition political parties. We went into an organization, we went into coalition with them under the auspices of a movement called Gerak, which means G-E-R-A-K, which means actually simply a movement. And we began to then, you know, dabble, you know, drew out, you know, like policy positions on a whole host of, you know, pretending as though we might come to power. And then we will have policies, you know, and at that point we sort of like led the discussion, because the political parties don't have that kind of, you know, they don't pay attention to this. They're all the time just mobilizing, and they can use ethnic, they can use religion, you know, Chinese, this and that, you know, to mobilize. So we were the ones who were more thinking. And so we began to help to play roles in, you know, helping draft policies on education from a more progressive perspective. You know, what do you do with local government? Oh, we want to bring back local government elections. You know, so this was our contribution, you know, and then they decided that, okay, we will, especially after Syed Hussein Ali joins, you know, and they launched their own party, you know, and so some of our friends who were previously involved in these social movements and more like civil society organizations, they actually begin to move into the political arena, the political party arena. So, you know, somebody, I'll give you names like Ramasamy himself, you know, he joins the DAP. And then you have people like, you know, Tian Zhua, who was very active with the group in Kuala Lumpur and all that in labor activity. He joins also Anwar's party. You know, and Syed Hussein also joins. Siva Rasa, human rights lawyer, he also joins. So they all join. But a group of us decided that we will not get involved in party politics. And we thought that it was still very, very important to actually continue to consolidate the public sphere. And we must keep it autonomous of the state, of the political parties which are ethnic based or, you know, religious based, and also of big business, of business. So we wanted to consolidate that public space. And this is what, you know, I mean, my involvement in Aliran, I've generally tried to steer it in this direction. You know, that we don't want, but we take the position that we want a two-party system. So when elections come around, we always tell people, our slogan is like, vote for democracy, which means actually consolidate the two-party system, which might actually mean vote for the opposition. You know, and if there are good, you know, government candidates, you know, Barisan Nasional candidates, we actually come out to support them. You know, and one such person is this Toh Kin Woon. You know, Toh Kin Woon was very close to Jomo, you know, these kinds of people. But he continued to work within the Parti Gerakan. And he would stand up to oppose the ISA, Internal Security Act. When Anwar was detained, he thought very unjustly. He broke ranks with his party and would go and, you know, visit the wife, you know, to be in solidarity with her. So there are mavericks like that. So our position would be, you support people like this as well, you know, although they might be from the ruling party. You know, and so, you know, it's so some of us would take that position as well. So we consolidate the middle ground, as it were, you know, outside of the control of the state, outside of control of the parties which are ethnic-based, religious-based, but also, you know, our space, because it's not dominated by big business, you know. So, and I think, increasingly, now that the opposition has been in power in Selangor and Penang, for a second round, some of us feel that actually we are vindicated, because they themselves have begun to adopt a lot of policies, economic policies, which are not very different from, the Barisan Nasional, the main federal ruling party. The big difference is that these people have open tenders, whereas the other one had what they call negotiated tenders, which means you do all the tendering behind closed doors, and we don't even know what and who gets it. Whereas these people, to their credit, they have adopted a policy of CAT, competency, accountability, and transparency. And actually, they have all their tenders public, and you can actually look for information. And then we push for, some of the people who went to government pushed for, and we fought for this and got a Freedom of Information Act, in these two states. But it doesn't apply at the federal level. It doesn't apply in other states controlled by the federal government. So, to that extent, having the two-party system has its benefits, So, like I also told you that in more recent times, I've been involved in fighting for the rights of schools. So, because of this because of the opposition coming to power in the two states, actually you see a change. Education comes under federal jurisdiction. So they decide on your curriculum, they decide on all the universities, the teachers are all employed by them. But the state governments in Selangor and Penang have been able to actually channel money to, some of these schools which have been actually never got money from federal government. So the Chinese schools, the Tamil schools, the independent Islamic schools, and also the mission schools. So, this is in a sense an advantage of having that two-party system. And I will also say that in the past, for instance, when we have our demonstrations and we have vigils for people who have been detained, it's a bit scary to go to, for all these things, because even in Penang, we will go to the esplanade, the big ground there. And as you approach it, they will have roadblocks all over the place, and just to scare you, because they cannot prevent you from going. And a lot of people, when they see, oh, there's a roadblock, they'll turn their cars around and go home, or they will go by the back door to come. But these days, when you have a vigil for an ISA detainee, former detainees like the Chief Minister of Penang, and all these people will also show up. So it's emboldens the people. And 2 years ago, Aliran organized the biggest rally that we have organized in Penang, about 10,000 people in the esplanade. And I had to go and get permission from the city council, but the city council now is under the control of the opposition chief minister. So it was not a problem. So we actually got that. And actually we organized it. And some of these people, they all came. So I think we were successful in mobilizing this crowd only because a lot of the opposition party people also came. This was a demonstration to call for free and fair elections, which is also up their alley. They're also interested to have this, kind of thing. So the big demonstrations, 50,000 strong, 100,000 strong, that was in Kuala Lumpur. And that's what hit the headlines. But actually, apart from the big demonstrations which took place and the march which took place in Kuala Lumpur, actually there were also smaller ones in Penang, in Kuching, where Andrew and all that are, in Seramban, in smaller towns. So, we also, that was something that we organized here, So, I think.
You mentioned Muto, we didn't come yet. So you mentioned that in the States, you were hearing so many intellectuals. So did you meet Muto in the States?
I didn't, but I actually went when I was undergraduate student. I'd been, anti-war, developed these kinds of things. So, and then I read his journal, called Ampo, published by Park and all that, And I was very keen to meet, because my whole experience about the war was actually very American. So I was very excited when, there's a Japanese perspective on this, and it was, in English, which I could access. I couldn't read the Japanese version, you see. What was it called? What was the Japanese version called? Roppongi?
Ampo.
Ampo.
Yeah. So it was the English version of the Japanese weekly journal, which we started. So we just used the name Ampo. Ampo is security.
Oh, security. So anyway, yeah, I know it. Yeah. So it's so we, I went to actually look for him, in Tokyo, because I knew his name, and then somebody gave me a contact number, and so went to look for him, and it's very difficult to look for him. So I was very glad that I met him. That was my first meeting with this man. 70s. Yeah, 70s. So he was up on the 4th floor, to climb up. But in the addresses of Tokyo, there's no order. It's generally in that area, so you must ask somebody who can show you. So that was, we were very keen to, my group at least, we were very keen to establish ties with radicals who are non-Americans. So that's why I told you when I went to Europe, and I began to meet people, that year when I went to, to study in France and all that. It was very exciting because you met people who were not Americans who actually shared the same ideas, and then subsequently when I came back to Southeast Asia in 1973, and then you begin to see, I went to Chulalongkorn University, and there was, because Chulalongkorn already began to have this ferment. That was 73, so it was very exciting, and then it was uplifting that you're not doing something very funny, and you're not isolated, you're part of a mass movement. And the Malaysian students generally also, especially in the UK, which was traditionally where Malaysians went to study, for their higher education and all that, they were very much more active as compared to us in America. But the students in the UK, they actually went in to study science, engineering, medicine, and lawyers. Whereas we in America ended up as academics. That's an interesting distinction, difference. But people like some of our Malay friends, they were also studying in the UK about the same time. So this would be people like Abdul Rahman Embong, who becomes the president of the, who's professor of sociology in the Universiti Kebangsaan, together with Ramasamy and all that. So they were studying there, and we will then begin to work with them very closely. Yeah, and I should also mention that actually USM, where I ended up in, was quite a special university, because we had a very important, we had a critical mass of Malays, Chinese, Indians, radicals, radical scholar activists, who began to make a difference. And during that time we would, this is not the students but the lecturers, we began to push for greater university autonomy but also more meritocracy, excellence, academic excellence. And from Penang you had people like Johan and some other people, who began to set up a national body for academics, national body for academics, and and mobilize the academics in this manner. You know, yeah. I just want to also mention that actually one of the things that I have been doing of my peers, actually I stayed in the university probably the longest, 30 plus years. You know, and people like Jomo, after a while he leaves, you know, goes to the UN system. Kejin leaves USM, Kejin, he moves to Sarawak, and then he begins to work with the Penans, you know, and finally he becomes an anthropologist, and then he begins to go grassroots, you know, and fought, you know, stood alongside them, you know, against the construction of dams and all that. In a sense, Andrew was talking about he's going to court these days and all that. He actually inherits that problem from Kejin, you know, after Kejin passed away. You know, so Kejin was doing these kinds of things. And so in my case, what I stayed on the university the longest, and I very consciously began to, you know, like mentor, you know, for want of a better word, began to actually nurture a next generation of scholar activists. And younger people like Soon, you know, and then in my Aliran Exco, there are 3 or 4 of my former students, you know, and I've never given a chance for them to run away, you know, I've dragged them in. And they have begun to appreciate that, you know, so they are very good scholars, but at the same time they must mix that scholarship with, you know, a measure of activism. I don't push them if they are not ready, but, you know, I've insisted that they must get involved in society and don't sit in the ivory tower, you know. And I think this is, you know, one of the things that I have actually achieved, you know, and I have done this very consciously, and I'm very proud of this, you know, and I know other people do it as well, but I consciously did this, and I stayed in the university throughout all this time also because it was a chance for me to continue to be in touch with especially Malay students. You know, I could have moved out to, I could have actually, you know, gone to overseas, you know, some, you know, very, you know, big name university, or I could have moved into private universities, but I wanted to stay in a public university, you know, to play this kind of a role. And it has been very, I think it has made me somebody who is, you know, more understanding of problems in Malaysia. You know, you can actually go into a private university, you know, you can be surrounded by very, very good students, but they might not actually be engaged in the kinds of issues that, you know, you have to be engaged with if you are in the public university. The students are not so bright. So, I mean, this is the thing that I consciously did, but I also began to, but, you know, throughout my career, I've also insisted on serious scholarship. You know, very, you know, and I pushed my students and I pushed myself to be a top-class scholar. You know, and this comes from the tradition, the training I got from George Cahin, Ben Anderson, and all that. And my style of writing, this kind of footnoting I do, comes from that tradition. You know, and you know, there is a little bit of a legacy.
Maybe I just have one last question, very quick last question. When you became a radical, then how did your family react to it? I mean, were your parents or your brothers felt that? Did they feel that you were sort of?
Or could you tell us a little bit about your family background?
Don't laugh.
Yeah.
Very famous family.
Are we still on ready?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I was born in Penang. You know, like Johan, everybody were all born in Penang, And my father died when I was in about 10 years old. So my family has been we were very poor, you know, and my mother brought us up 7 children. You know, she was 30 something years old. You know, she was 35 years old, I think, and she had 7 children. She had married when she was 18 years old during the Japanese War. So, and people were telling her that you cannot, how can you, a woman, you know, bring up all these children on your own, and how are you going to live? You know, you don't even have a job. You know, but my mother, and they wanted to break up my family. So my mother said, no way. And she said, we will manage. And my father had bought a house, and you know, it wasn't paid up, but because he died, the insurance paid for the house. So we had a house. And my mother used to know how she studied music in the convent. So she began to, you know, open a kindergarten, you know, and taught some music. You know, she wasn't qualified by any means, you know, but she just did this. And she then brought us up, and we were poor, but we became very close together, you know, because this how we did. And and all of us were actually, none of us were in school yet. None of us had graduated from school. So my eldest sister, brother, you know, they had to come out to work as soon as they finished high school. The first one went to teachers college for 1 year, and then they came out. But none of them. I'm the first one to go to university.
You are the young?
I'm number 4.
Number 4.
I'm number 4. So we're very, very close. And so the biggest influence on my life is actually my mother. You know, and she has always taught us to be frugal, and she drilled into us that the way out for our family is education. You know, there was no other way. You know, we don't have anything, so we struggled and all, but education was emphasized now. So, you know, it's very like overseas Chinese type of, you know, so it's that was how we did that. And she was very close to the church, and that's how she managed. You know, the family was very important to her, and her God, you know.
Catholic?
Yeah, Catholic family. That's why we have 7 children. You know, big Catholic family.
And the music, all that came from her also?
Yeah, because she learned, you know, in the convent, she learned how to play the piano, you know, from a nun, you know, and she didn't know that one day she would use that to make a living. You know, so she did that. So I was the first one to have this opportunity to go to the university, and in this case I got a scholarship, you know, to go to America to study. Otherwise I would never have. So you know, my mother was very sad, but she let me go. And then later on, when I became radicalized, you know, this all happened outside of her presence, you see. You know, outside of her presence. So, you know, I mean, she didn't see me going to demonstration and things like that. You know, this was all in America. So when I finally came back, you know, I had mellowed down a bit, you know, and so long as I contributed towards the family, you know, and they accepted the change that had occurred in me. But towards the end, my mother was very, very proud of me. And she would come to our aliran functions. You know, she would come to aliran functions, and you know, and she would also even speak out and argue with some of these people. So I don't know whether it was her, you know, her maturing as a woman who went through a very tough life, you know, that she could actually identify with some of the things that we were saying. Yeah, but she would also embarrass me all the time. Nah. She would say, "Oh, that's my son, you know." Yeah, so my sister, the family is very supportive. My sister is Judy, you know, she became the president of the women's group in Kuala Lumpur. There's one in Penang, but my sister is, you know, also she became the president for a few years, you know, And when I organized this Aliran dinner, you know, in Penang with fundraising, I went back to them and collected money from all of them. And they I gave them no chance, but you know, they they were not reluctant, but they said, wow, you know, so I collected money from them. So they are supportive to that extent lah. And they are part of this middle class. They are all very successful today. They're part of this middle class in Malaysia, especially among the non-Malays, who generally welcome these political changes that have occurred in the country. And you know, they're very supportive of the reformasi movement, you know, the new situation where you have you know, more space for, you know, and yeah. And I send them all our Aliran publications and all that, so they know I don't hide this from them lah. And they, except for my dad's sister and my mother herself, the others they're more involved in their own business and profession and all that, but they are not against what I'm doing. Yeah, and it's they are, in a sense, part of the group in Malaysia, you know, middle class, educated, who are looking for answers, and they are not against what's taking place, and they see me as part of that movement. Yeah.